Today, lies, damn lies, and statistics. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, world's latest post covering finance and property news. Well, Tarric is back for another chat on a Friday. And Tarric, there's a lot to talk about, particularly about when our numbers not numbers.
Oh, yeah. Well, let's just get straight into the controversy, shall we? The ABS sent out some correspondence to Leith Van Onselen at Macro Business and a few other people, including the Daily Mail and 2GB, regarding the migration figures, or in particular, how the net long-term and permanent arrivals figures should not be conflated with the net migration number, except that's not what Leith and the rest of them have done. I don't know about the rest of them, but I do know, because I've spoken to Leith about this, that's not what Leith has done. It's very much a case of, he said that it is a directional indicator, and it's funny that they should say that because that's also what the federal government says in their own paperwork telling people how to measure migration on a short-term basis. So I thought that was rather funny.
Well, it's more than funny, it's very concerning. And there's a thematic here. It isn't just the ABS in Australia, but statistical agencies and other places are also getting a lot of flack. For example, in the UK, there was a review of the Office of National Statistics that came out in June. And basically, they were rubbished. They said they didn't have the right culture in the place, but more importantly, the fundamental focus on producing good statistics had actually gone off the boil, and they were experimenting with lots of other sort of flashy, easy statistics, but the core stuff that needed to be done wasn't being done, and that was very, very critical. And in fact, the ONS has delayed their retail sales information, which was due out today, because of quality issues. So once again, more statistics delayed. And of course, in the US, we have the BLS with their issues with regard to survey levels. So the worrying thing is that more and more, I think, 2 points. One, the accuracy of data is in question, but more importantly, the politicization of data is now the real question. And that means that we can't necessarily rely on the critical indicators. Now, that makes central bankers' lives even more complicated or unneeded, depending on how you think about it. But for everyday use, we don't know what the truth is.
Well, I think part of the problem is there's also the issue just of perception, like with Trump firing the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, regardless of whether or not inflation does get tamed, or regardless of what the statistics actually say, whether they're accurate or not, that the perception will now be that there's just going to be that doubt in the back of everyone's mind of, was this politically motivated? Is this actually real? Because this isn't because it's not that hard for inflation to diverge from perceptions of inflation, because it's very different on a lot of cases to the way people perceive inflation, with it through their own lives and through their own experiences. Although I do think one thing that is interesting is I've just been looking into statistical agencies that were proven to be lying and politicized, and turns out the Argentinian statistical agency has been caught doing that in the past. So it's not entirely unprecedented for agencies to do that. And it is just very, very disappointing to see this level of interference, because it does damage that perception. And I think one of the key issues with just statistics and financial markets and economics in general is perception is everything. Trust is everything. And when you start undermining that trust even a little bit, things can unravel uncomfortably quickly.
Well, it also, of course, opens the door for other players who do have vested interests to push their particular lens on statistics. And I'm thinking perhaps of some of the property statistics, for example, that we see in Australia and other countries too, that actually comes from bodies that have a vested interest in property. Or the information that comes from the banks with regard to customer behavior and how many customers are paying back their loans or not, etc., etc. Those are not official statistics. Those are actually vested statistics, right? And I just wonder to what extent any numbers can be really trusted. Even if you look at the public accounts of companies, there are intrinsic assumptions and positionings made. Now, I worked years ago for Anderson, and they were in the middle of a whole bunch of issues where they were effectively repurposing information going into official statistics into the accounts of large corporations for the benefit of those corporations. So, what is truth?
Well, I think that's one of the big problems, isn't it? And it is just the fact, it is true that I think that these companies really, not these companies, these countries really need to get on these statistics issues much, much more seriously than they have. I mean, like the ABS, for example, abandoned the various household expenditure measures that they and household income measures that they were going to be releasing this year, and that's deeply, deeply disappointing because that is very, very important data, very, very granular data, which is something that we very much lack. Because it goes down to an individual household demographic lens, which is something that we very much lack overall. And I think that it's just very disappointing to just be stuck with this high level data that doesn't tell the story of the Australian people. And I think that as nerdy as it may sound, which will surprise absolutely no one, this data is needed for our democracy to properly function. Because without it, you don't actually know what's happening from a statistical perspective. Now, don't get me wrong, you can probably talk to the staffers at MP's office, the staffers at various government services, and they will tell you what's wrong with the health system or what is going wrong with people's lives and stuff like that. But you only have anecdotes. You don't have hard data from which policy solutions at a grander level can be put together. So it's a really, really huge issue that I would say very, very few people in power are interested in fixing.
Well, if you look at some of the recent Senate inquiries, and I'm thinking of the one relating to housing, for example, where Senator Bragg was pushing quite hard on so how many houses have actually you really built, and there was a lot of spin coming from the government about how much they were spending and all their momentum, etc. So yes, but how many houses have you actually built? So the problem, of course, is that if the data is actually not very available, or if the data can be spun in a particular way, it will be. So what it means is that when you actually come to political debates or policy settings, you have a sense of queasiness about how the reality is. And I come back to my surveys because, of course, those are bottom up, talking to real households, and the gap between the perceived reality based on the top-down data and based on the government positioning about what's going on and financial sector positioning and what's actually going on at the ground level, looking at real households and what they're facing, there is a huge gap. And I don't see any particular appetite amongst those in charge to try and bridge that gap.
No, and I think one of the funny things is I think it was last year during a parliamentary committee meeting with with Michelle Bullock and other members of the Reserve Bank, they were asked about the impact of the Bank of Mum and Dad, which is something that that you have researched extensively, probably one of the most extensively, in Australia, if not the most, and they didn't know, they didn't have data on it, and you're talking about something that is potentially underpinning more than half, some say up to 75% of new home purchases. And the formation of new households of first home buyers buying homes is an absolutely vital economic indicator. Because it determines things like demand for household goods. It determines the upward pressure on housing prices overall. Because if you juice the first home buyer sector, that often feeds through as a precursor to a larger move in housing prices. So there's all these various different moving parts. and they didn't know, and they still don't know. And I just think that there's just all of these little pieces of the puzzle that people like yourself and others have that would be vital to policymakers, but just end up getting largely ignored. I mean, I think it's also just worth noting, just because it's interesting, that you've got a situation where somewhere between over half of people are receiving some form of parental help, to up to, as I said, one University of Melbourne study cited a figure of up to 75% receiving help from friends and family. And then you've got another somewhere between one third and 40%. Obviously, there's crossover between the two, receiving help from the federal government with the various home guarantee schemes. So basically, when you look at it, the idea of organic home ownership, of just achieving it on your own, as people used to in decades past, is now a minority experience, which I think is just, frankly, it's just a fascinating thing that needs to be assessed. And we need to be looking, how can we go back to the point where people can just buy houses on their own without having Albo standing next to them or mum and dad?
Well, that's a really important point. And of course, that extra injection of capital, whether it's come from intergenerational equity or whether it's come from the government, allows property prices to continue to rise. All the research from all of the, like the Productivity Commission highlights the fact that the more that you help people get into the market, the more you lift prices. When we saw through Home Builder the impact of that, that translated almost directly to further price rises, for example, in Western Australia. I saw it there. So there is a big question as to how much of the bubbliness of housing is related specifically to the equity injection from the Bank of Mum and Dad and other players, and the government support for housing, which is still, huge and continuing. And then you say, well, what about those who don't get that help or can't get that help? The other point there, Tarric, is we are moving more and more to what I call subscription housing. And what I mean by that is that you are paying over time longer and longer and longer. And so the average mortgage duration is blowing out. We'll have 40, 50-year mortgages and maybe even longer mortgages soon. Or if you think of the build to rent sector and the way that that is actually deliberately putting more people into the rental sector and getting them to pay through their life for the property that they're renting. So we seem to have got to the situation now where the default setting for future housing policy is a subscription model rather than an ownership model. And I actually think that's very concerning, and it's something that I don't think many people have actually woken up to, or indeed would have voted for.
No, and I think another part of the sort of subscriptionization, shall we say, of housing is the issue of strata, because it's very much a poorly misunderstood black box of what's the average strata fee in Australia, for example. We don't know. There's surveys on it, but is there hard government data? Nope. Is there data on the median? No. Is there data on the highest percentiles? No. So, you've got this huge push to get more and more people into apartments and more people into strata communities. But there's not the data there to really confirm as to how much the strata fees are actually going to cost over the lifetime of a property. And that's a huge problem, because you've got this idea of, oh, well, it's okay, you don't need to buy a freestanding house, you don't need that, you can just go buy an apartment. But when you're looking at that same apartment, of which, what was the latest data with the New South Wales government? It was 40% of recently built apartments in New South Wales have a major defect.
Yep.
So, is it really that hard to imagine that people are going to be paying the equivalent in today's terms of $7,000, $10,000, $15,000 in strata fees for these remediation works, as these buildings, as as well, we hope not, but as you get reruns of Mascot Towers and all that other sort of stuff that you and Edwin have covered so extensively over the last couple of years.
Well, the Strata story is one that is not being told well. For example, in Canberra, there was some research that showed that one of the primary reasons why people were actually going into financial distress or indeed bankruptcy were those lifting strata fees. Because, of course, it might start low in the first year or two, but when the defects start popping up, then the strata fees really ramp up. And certainly I've had one-to-one conversations with people who are actually desperate because the strata fee wasn't that big when they got the property, but now it's not just tripled, but it's quadrupled, or in some cases even 10 times what it was, and still growing uncontrollably. Now, that information is not reported in any of the CPI information, for example. It might or might not be sort of embedded in rentals. And one of the reasons why rents are going up, when you actually look at what people are told, it's often the strata fees, which is in turn putting the rentals up. And if you're an owner, of course, you have to pay the strata yourself. If you're a renter, then the investor is paying the strata fees. But these strata fees are not managed very well. They're not controlled. And when you actually look at the basis on which some of those fees are actually calculated and lifted, it's very murky. And you wonder who is profiting from that and who is actually going to be able to pay. And what happens when you find that out of a block where there are 20 owners, 2 or 3 or 4 of them are unable to pay? Well, does that mean that everybody else has to pay more? Or does it mean that the work not get done? And then you start to realize that there is a whole web of concern here that could start unraveling. And again, I don't believe that this is a debate that is being had, but certainly should be being had. And at the moment, the bottom line is that subscription housing is becoming more and more the mainstream thought about how to deal with housing into the future. And I've got a problem with that.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I was talking to someone the other day who's one of the members of the board of corporate for the unit complex. And, they were saying there's a whole bunch of investors who own these apartments who just simply they just don't pay. They just say, well, no, just not going to do it. They keep saying, well, they keep saying no. And the reality is that the cost of chasing that up in court to a point where you're actually going to get an enforceable judgment is going to cost so much money that it's not worth pursuing until the debt gets absolutely huge. And, and just on the issue, like you were saying, then does the work not get done? And I would say that the answer in a lot of cases is very much yes, because the cash just isn't there. And as the burden of those strata fees falls on a smaller and smaller and smaller group of people, the less likely it becomes that the work will get done, the less likely it becomes that the property gets maintained, and the more likely it becomes that greater issues will arise from that lack of maintenance.
So just to explain, folks, Tarric had a little bit of an issue with his audio. You may have heard there for the last few minutes, but I think we've fixed it now. So we're going to continue the conversation. And we were just talking about Strata and all of the issues there, and making the point that things are very uncomfortable for many people in the Strata sector. And it's part of the sort of the tapestry of the housing story, which I think takes us quite nicely, Tarric, as we get into your slides in 1 second, is just to reflect on the so-called imperative from the 3-day love-in in Canberra, which really didn't come up with much at all, did it? Other than that they're going to put taxes up.
No, it was. I mean, it accomplished exactly what everyone was thinking it would accomplish, which is a whole lot of nothing. I mean, to be completely fair, we talked about this in the last show. That basically, the government has tied themselves in a policy straitjacket, ruling this out, ruling that out, to the point where they really can't do a whole lot without breaking a promise and breaking their word. So I think that we're basically just stuck. Although one thing I will say is that it's very interesting to see exactly how stuck the government is, given the fact that they have got the biggest Labor majority in something like 80 years.
Yes, that is very, very interesting. Now, of course, that vote was on 1/3 of the votes, but nevertheless, they have a large majority. And when you actually listen to the real story here, it comes back to some of the fundamentals that we keep highlighting about the weakness of the Australian economy, the narrowness, the fact that the government is spending big relative to the income that is coming in, and of course also the intergenerational issues that are there for anybody to see who wants to see them. But it also, to me, highlights that the complexity of trying to solve this without actually addressing some of those fundamental structural issues like questioning migration, for example, or questioning the continued perpetual rise of home prices, both of which should be, I think, on the agenda, and the gas story. None of those really were for at the front and for the center of what they were talking about, because they were looking, I think, essentially for a blessing to sort of continue to do the sort of the muddling on that they were doing, but that's about it.
There was a very interesting article the other day from the ABC, which contained something that I was quite surprised by, just by how explicitly they said that economists at the event had basically ruled out anything on two of the key Ps, which were property and population. And that was absolutely spot on commentary. The idea that we can somehow address productivity without touching the fact that property acts as this giant vacuum cleaner, sucking up capital, sucking up years of people's productive lives just so they can get a roof over their head instead of doing something like starting a business or choosing to be an innovator in their own way, whether it's at their source of employment or not, because they're just focused on, being able to get their own roof over their head or keep their own roof over their head. And then there's population. And this is something that you talked about with Leith a few weeks ago. Just the fact that the more people you keep adding into a country without building the requisite housing, the requisite infrastructure, and enhancing services, the less productivity growth there will be on offer, because there's basically just less infrastructure, less factories, less you name it, to go around on a per head basis. So there's just these absolutely vital issues. And I will say, even that little report by the RBA on productivity the other day, they mentioned the issue of capital shallowing, which is basically what happens when you don't invest enough in infrastructure. The private sector doesn't invest enough in the various means of production, and all you end up with is more people sharing the same base. So I do think it's funny that even the RBA mentioned it and throwing their little tiny jab in the way that they felt was appropriate given the confines of their position.
Yes. Well, of course, the RBA is an interesting position because they don't want to throw too many rocks, but they did throw a couple of rocks in, very importantly, but they were pretty much ignored in the 3 days. Tarric, we should get onto your slides because you've put a lot of work into them. And, this is a very important part of the conversation that people tune in for. So let's give it a go.
Righto. As usual, the slides will be available at burnouteconomics.com. Martin will be including a link to them in the description. And if you would like to subscribe to Burnout Economics, or if you would like to subscribe to my new YouTube channel, which Martin also has a link to in the description, we'll also have little clips of DFA before we move on to bigger and better things, hopefully later in the year or next year. Now, there is a lot of discussion surrounding the issue of the number of mortgages being written. Well, not the number of mortgages being written. There's a lot of discussion around the level of new mortgage debt being written, because you see it all the time. It's heading up towards new highs in dollar value terms, etc., etc. But once you break it down into not the dollar value, but the actual nominal number of mortgages being written, and then you look at it in per capita terms for, say, owner-occupiers, the level of housing activity in the nation's housing sector is actually very, very, very depressed in per capita terms. So while there's this idea that there's this unquenchable demand for housing, and that is true within the confines of the housing supply and demand curve, in actuality, the level of turnover within the market on a per capita basis for owner-occupiers is almost half what it was at the peak in the early to mid 2000s.
Absolutely, and it's very interesting, Tarric, when you look at the numbers. Aggregate level, total credit is growing much faster than inflation. It's being supported by a stronger growth in investment lending compared to owner-occupier lending. But if you look at it, the average value of the loan is still rising, and the volume is hardly rising at all. And then when you actually look at first-time buyers or new, it's very, very low. And I'm seeing that in the listings data too. So there are actually there are more properties listed compared to last year, but the transaction volume is still relatively low as well. So the story that we're in a really hot market and everything is going gangbusters and everybody's trying to crowd into the market, which of course is what the the mainstream property spruikers are on about, is a million miles away from what the data says.
One thing that I think is really interesting, that where Australia differs dramatically to the US, Canada, and New Zealand these days, is the total level of homes on the market for sale. Now, in the US, there's more than COVID. It's the same story in Canada. In Canada, they're pushing up towards decade highs of stock on the market. New Zealand is seeing surging levels of stock on the market above pre-COVID levels as well. But in Australia, it's deeply depressed below pre-COVID levels because we've had that constant demand driven by the ongoing rental crisis, which came to an end in the US at a national level over 2 years ago now. But ours still persists. Canada's rental crisis has more or less come to an end. There is enough supply, probably not at the right price, but it does exist. And Canada's now seeing rents plummet in some of the most impacted cities and locales. So I think it's interesting just how varied that is because of the decisions that policymakers have taken here in Australia compared with the rest of the Anglosphere.
Well, of course, the two big differences between New Zealand, Canada, and Australia is migration. So they dialed back migration in New Zealand, and they dialed back migration in Canada, and the whole lending environment, which has been sharpened up in those areas compared with Australia. It's interesting. The New Zealand Reserve Bank cut the interest rate again, but as part of the conversation after that, they did admit that the chances were that property prices were going to continue to fall, and they're 17% down from their peaks in New Zealand. They're dropping in Canada as well. Rental availability is rising. Rents are actually not growing. So you can see how the migration element flows into the whole picture, but nobody really wants to move the dial in that direction in Australia for one obvious reason. We've got to keep growing that number because it's the only number to make the GDP grow.
It is, and I think you make a very important point with the New Zealand example, because one of the big differences between New Zealand and Australia in this rental cycle, shall we call it, is during the pandemic, Australia was one of the last countries to really reopen to the rest of the world in a meaningful way, but the last was New Zealand. So you got to see the legacy of the pandemic-driven rental crisis in New Zealand for a lot longer, whereas Australia's rental crisis never really got to an end point because it was just bang, borders reopen, record migration, demand to rentals to the moon. Whereas New Zealand had that little bit longer, and you started to see rents flatline, and it was just like, okay, so that's what it would look like if we didn't make that particular decision. Literally, I believe Auckland rents just prior to, it might have actually been just after they reopened their borders, was 0% growth year on year, which was, obviously very, very nice for people who were experiencing some challenging times. Yet here in Australia, we persist with this idea that somehow, well, not we, but far too many people persist with the idea that migration has a very, very limited impact on the rental market. When in actual fact, you look around the rest of the world that isn't running these large migration numbers, and rents are moderating. So in some cases they're flatlining, in some cases they're outright falling. So there are pathways for which policymakers can pursue to, for more favourable outcomes for the populace, but as you say, they're not terribly desirable from their rather narrow perspective.
No, and I just want to come back to the other point, the listings number. Listings are actually up from last year, but when you actually look at what property is actually being listed, there is a greater proportion of, I call them lemons, property that needs a lot of work or are in some adverse condition or position. And those are the ones that are hanging around on the market. So if you look at the number of new properties coming on and being sold relative to the ones over 90 days or 180 days, well, the 180-day and 90-day count is rising and rising and rising. So we've got this splodge of very unattractive property that nobody really wants to buy, and they're probably overpriced as well, by the way, as well. So when you actually sort of parse the numbers, the truth is that the active proportion that are listed and sold is a very small sort of slice across the top.
Yeah, no, 100% agree with you. Exactly. Now, I think this is an interesting chart because you see the charts of, well, this is how many homes we're building, this is what we've done. But the thing is, the overwhelming majority of Australians don't want an apartment. So the overall number isn't really as helpful as we would like. So this is actual detached houses built on a rolling annual basis per 100,000 people. And as you can see, at least for this shortened data set, that from the start of the 1980s, the peak was actually around about 1990, so 35 years ago. And since then, the level of new homes per capita, new homes being built per capita, I should say, has dropped dramatically. So it just goes to show that even though across the breadth of this chart that migration has been increased dramatically, the number of homes that we're actually building for people, the number of desirable detached houses we're building for people has decreased significantly and is at, at least based on this data set, near record lows.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is if you look at the absolute count of houses that we're building, it's still going up. So, there is still momentum. But because of the very high population growth and particularly migration, driving that, we're just not standing still. We're going backwards. And that's another reason why the property price problem continues. And I want to underscore again, it's fascinating to me when you actually talk to people, as I do in my one-on-one conversations, how many of those do not want to buy an apartment and feel that they're almost forced because there's no choice other than to buy these little dog boxes. And there are three reasons. One is the fact that the quality of the construction is of major concern to them. The second is, as the strata fee issue comes up again, they're worried about that. But thirdly, they're just worried about living on top of each other and the lack of space, the ability to park or drive around and all those things. So the whole lifestyle question comes to the fore too. So there is a real contention between the political view of how to solve the problem, which is build up, build small, build cheap, and build quick, and what people actually want.
Yeah, well, I think that there's multiple sort of avenues where this is the wrong path, because I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with apartment living. Like if you, I mean, I've rented apartments and stuff like that on holiday, with people next door having parties, doing all sorts of stuff. And I remember one time I had a man from next door come over and try to apologize to me, and he said to me, "I'm so sorry. My daughter was up all night teething. She hasn't stopped. I apologize profusely." And I said to him, "What noise?" Because instead of it being like in Australia where you can hear someone walking around upstairs in some of these apartments, the wall was concrete and about 14 inches thick. So it's not that apartment living is not a viable strategy conceptually. It can or even in reality. It's just not a terribly viable reality from an Australian perspective in too many cases. It's not, and the reality is that there are, don't get me wrong, there are apartment complexes in Australia that are great. It's particularly some of the older ones that are very, very well built. They're built, to basically, they're like cockroaches. They'd last a nuclear war. But the problem is too often, as the data from, say, for example, the New South Wales government shows, too often they're not built to an adequate standard. And as far as I know, that in a lot of cases, they're not even built to, say, acoustic standards, which is, the travel of noise between various different apartments. And it's very disappointing because it leaves people in a very, very bad spot. And just one other point, and I won't go on for too much longer, but there's also the issue that there's this idea of you can just trade up from an apartment to a house. And in some cases, yes, people have been able to do that. But given the fact that detached housing tends to appreciate far more quickly than apartments on a general basis, there are a lot of people out there, even people on really good incomes. I'm talking, $250,000, $300,000, who want to buy a house, who should be able to buy a house, in the sort of, more upmarket areas that they not, we'll just say, more upmarket areas that are generally reflective of an income in that particular percentile, who can't. And I think that's going to be a really, really big problem going forward, both politically and socially, of just people, even people who have done relatively well income-wise, who are not going to be able to afford the lifestyle that their parents had when there was one parent working and they worked as a bus driver.
Well, I've had several one-on-one conversations in recent weeks with people who are frustrated just on that point, that they've got this apartment, but actually the value of that apartment is going down, not up, because of the extra strata fees and the fact that there's a lot of other apartments very similar now being built in the surrounding area. So they're actually getting further and further away from their objective, which was to buy an apartment, live in it for a little while, sell it, and then move on and get a house. So the gap's getting ever bigger, which is quite, I think, a very important observation. The other observation, just to come back to the Canberra Talk Fest this last week, of course, there was a lot of discussion about building standards and how building codes and things were getting in the way. It's all part of red tape. And implicit in that is there are people who think we should reduce the standards and reduce the complexity. Well, I would argue that no, it's important to have really good building standards, and particularly acoustic standards, as well as fire regs and those sorts of things, to make sure that people are living in safe and comfortable places. Because all the research shows that actually it's things like noise, and particularly noise through the night, which can be really, really destructive from a societal and from a health perspective.
Yeah, well, there's also the physical perspective where it can tend to provoke altercations, and I've heard of quite a few people in apartments where things are less than soundproof having issues with neighbours and the police as a result. But it is just. I'm gonna say something that's probably going to annoy some people, but here we are. I'm not a huge fan of the current approach of the YIMBY movement, the yes in my backyard. Because as long as we are in a situation where we are growing housing demand faster than we are growing housing supply, it's not going to matter how many houses we built, or how much we cut red tape, or or how quickly we build even. It's just not going to matter, because at the end of the day, whatever supply is there will be consumed. I mean, if some of the numbers from Shane Oliver are correct, Shane Oliver, the chief economist down at AMP, if are correct, we have a housing deficit of somewhere between 250 and 300,000 homes. If we take the numbers from the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council at face value, that shortage is going to keep getting worse until 2029. Now, it's not that the shortage is going to stop getting worse in 2029. It's just that's when their forecast period ends. And that is based on the idea that the migration forecasts get realised, which is looking increasingly doubtful. So there's a lot of different issues that I think we need to be addressing first before we even arrive at a point where that is the main focus of our concern. Now, I'm not saying that there is. I mean, it's clear. Look at the apartments. Look at some of these houses falling down. Of course, there needs to be changes to regulations. Needs to be changes to red tape that has seen the size of the white collar construction workforce more than double, while the size of the actual tradie workforce at the coalface hasn't managed to keep up with, and not by a long shot. So there are changes that can be made. I totally agree, but I just don't think that they should be the number one priority at the moment, to be completely honest.
Well, no, that's right. And I just want to highlight what you said, because I think it's really important. There is so much demand that people will almost buy anything, even if it's poorly built, even if it's expensive, even if it's poorly located, because of the desperation. And it's the desperation that's sitting there below the surface, which I think is the real issue that should be being spoken about. But I don't recall that being part of the agenda over the last 3 days.
No, and this is something that you and I have talked about a lot, and I wrote an article based on your data on this, I think it was last year, that people are still very much in desperation mode. That like they're buying whatever they can to escape the challenging circumstances of the rental market. And I talk to people about this, people who've got good rental histories, people who've been, really solid tenants for a decade with really good jobs. But when you're bidding against all these other people, and when you're in a situation where someone else says, well, I'm going to put up 3 months rent, 6 months rent, 9 months rent in cash, it's very, very difficult for these people to compete. Yep. Particularly in certain areas, if you've got to be there for work. So it's a mess. And it's a mess that the government is willfully making, well, perhaps not making worse, but exacerbating to the point where it continues to suck.
Well, that's because they don't really want to address the fundamentals that would need to be addressed, because it's uncomfortable, difficult for them. And, they want to make sure that the election cycle works in their favor ahead. And perhaps some of the things they should be doing wouldn't necessarily be advantageous to them from that perspective, but would be advantageous from an ordinary household perspective.
Yeah, just before we get into the next slide, just one little thing. 65% of renters vote Labor. So why would you want to raise the home ownership rate if you were a Machiavellian bastard only interested in getting re-elected?
That's a really interesting observation. Thank you for that.
Now, I really like this chart because a while ago, the current Housing Minister, Claire O'Neill, came out and said that we've got an issue in Australia that we have fewer homes per capita than all these countries in Europe and all these other places and XYZ. And yes, Claire O'Neill was absolutely correct. But the important thing is why. Australia builds more homes per capita, than anywhere else in the Anglosphere. By a fairly substantial margin, and as you can see from the chart, has been building more houses or more homes per capita for most of the last 40 years. Yet Australia, with the possible exception of Canada, is the one with the most acute housing shortage. So is the problem really supply, or is it in fact demand?
Oh, you can't talk about demand being the problem, Tarric. That's very un-Australian. Tut, tut, tut.
Oh, well, here I am. I'm doing it. We're doing it.
Yeah. I mean, isn't that the point? Isn't that the point? When you actually stop and think about it, we are actually quite good at building some sort of property, even if it's not very good property. The numbers speak for themselves. But we are being flooded with huge demand, thanks to migration, and also, of course, some local demand through, because there is a natural flow of people, moving to form households and who need somewhere to live. Although actually household formation is a lot slower and older than what it used to be because of the problem of housing. And the predominant demand lever is the need to house all those migration people who come in, the people coming in, of course. And there was a 2GB thing, did you see that the other day, making the point that pretty much every minute there's somebody new coming in.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I think is interesting is there's the issue of the housing crisis, right? Now, the problem with the term housing crisis is different people different people have different things that they're assessing. it's not just one issue. There's two separate issues. There's the issue of the availability of rentals, which I think this particular chart illustrates quite nicely, and the fact is that we shouldn't have a problem with housing all of our people. And then there is the issue of affordable housing to buy, which is a separate issue, which is most certainly impacted by other factors such as the demand from property investors. But if we focus in purely on the demand, the supply and demand curve for the availability of properties just to house people overall, not necessarily who actually ends up owning them, that is where it becomes impossible to avoid the impact of migration, considering the fact that migration has been the overwhelming driver of demand for housing for the best part of the last 20 years, with the exception of obviously during COVID when the borders were closed, which, obvious reasons.
Absolutely. And what they did when the borders were closed to keep the demand for property up? They did a whole bunch of other things. They gave some money away here and there and everywhere to try and actually get more people to buy home and land packages and things like that. Anything to keep that feeding the beast going.
Exactly. And I think the problem is that the current migration intake is in some ways the one of the few levers that they could have pulled to protect to support the property market. Because you look around the world at all these other places that haven't been able to do it. Say, for example, in well, they could have, but they didn't. You look at New Zealand, for example. If their migration continued to run at the level that Australia is running today, their property market would have been looking at a different scenario. But the problem is that they couldn't just turn around and go, oh, we're going to throw $10 billion at first homeowner grants, or we're going to throw home builder, $15 billion at home builder 2.0, or whatever normal demand side stimulus that they would take, because it would have been inflationary and they would have copped crap from the RBA and everybody else. But by using the migration lever, by using that particular driver of demand, they managed to support the property market. I mean, admittedly, at the expense of the overwhelming majority of Australians of their fortunes, but they managed to accomplish their goal. And it didn't cost them anything.
That's right. And of course, the GDP bubbled slightly higher. So they're able to claim that they never really had the same recessionary forces in other places and a whole bunch of other consequences. And it goes back to if you prioritize just that GDP top line number and then don't think about the consequences and implications for real ordinary people, then that's where you end up.
Well, I think I'm not going to make a statement here, but I'm going to pose a question, and people can share their views in the comments. But I think we really have to ask ourselves, why are we continuing to run a migration intake that is so large that even by the government's own admission, we are not going to be able to build enough homes to house everyone? Even though the fact that you've got the likes of the ABC talking about the fact that we have one of the worst housing crises and the worst, one of the worst levels of homelessness in living memory.
Yep.
I think that's a question that people, should ask themselves, and if they feel so inclined, ask their local MP.
And while they're doing that, they should also ask their local MP about whether, in fact, in the upcoming census that the ABS is going to be running, whether they will be surveying those people in tent cities and those people living in cars. Or do you actually have to have an official address to be inquired on the census? Just a thought.
That is a very, very good question, Martin. I thoroughly concur. I think all Australians deserve to be counted and deserve to be heard. And if the viewers can help to achieve that outcome, I would be most proud.
Absolutely. Well, it's critical to me. If you in fact end up with a set of census data that only includes those people living in houses and apartments and, not actually taking account of the significant numbers of people who are not living in formal accommodation, then that's a real problem.
No, I thoroughly agree with you. Now, this alludes to what we were talking about earlier regarding the issue of, is the measure of net long-term and permanent arrivals akin to net migration. Now, as the chart shows, it's not perfect. They are not a one-for-one comparison. They have been rather close in the past, but in the present day, no, they are not. But as you can see from the chart, they are a fairly solid directional indicator. Now, one of the big issues with the net migration data is, as of the time of the recording of this show, the latest data we have only covers up till the end of 2024 for net migration. Yet, for net long-term and permanent arrivals, that data covers all the way up until the middle of June. So I think that really sort of just illustrates the problem that we have here, because we've got this huge blind spot. We've got, almost 8 months of not knowing what's been going on in 2025. But the net long-term and permanent arrivals numbers do give us a degree of insight into what is potentially happening. So I think that it's a valuable indicator. It's not the be-all and end-all, but it is definitely useful for picking up those directional shifts before you see them in the very much lagged net migration data.
Yeah, and in fact, the government does confirm, doesn't it, when they talk about these various forms of statistics, that those arrival indicators are a useful signal for what's happening. So I don't understand why the ABS tries to say you can't use it.
Yeah, it's a bad look, and I'm not going to get too much further into it, but I guess we'll see what happens and what comes out over the coming months about why this has happened and what exactly is going on behind the scenes.
Indeed.
Now, this one is an interesting one. It's from the recent the recent data from CBA, and what it shows is that people are paying more down on their mortgage than they were in previous years. Well, with the exception of 2020 in this particular instance. And what this basically shows, and what what CBA's conclusion is that people are not really spending their rate cuts. Some of them are, but for the most part, they're using it to pay down their mortgage and pay down debt and rebuild those buffers that they depleted since rates began to rise back in 2022. So it just shows how reliant the Aussie economy is on the wealth effect and migration on boosting the fortunes of the broader growth path going forward, and that rate cuts cannot necessarily be relied upon to mechanically, as in put more cash in people's pockets to spend in the way that they used to.
Well, I think it goes back to what you said earlier on about the fact that the housing monster is now so huge that it's consuming an ever greater proportion of people's income. And what that means is that even if rates come down a bit, they're not necessarily going to spend it and give the economy a bit of a kick. They're going to try and actually get their own financial situation in a slightly better fettle. And that means, in some cases, paying that. It's interesting. I talk to people through the one-on-one conversations that I have. And this idea of getting rid of the loan as quickly as possible is becoming quite a strong thematic. I remember 5 years ago, I was having, this is before COVID, I had conversations with people and they basically said, look, I'm not sure that there's a real need to sort of pay down quick. Having a loan is part of the story and interest rates are relatively low, so it's not a problem. But that's all changed. So there seems to be, to me, a much stronger driver now for people to want to get shot of their debt. Now, some people can do that, but the problem with this sort of information is it doesn't give you distributional information from different cohorts. And what I'm seeing is that the more affluent households are actually those who are paying down quite fast, whereas those who are actually under more duress from a financial perspective are not paying down. And in some cases, they're still in hardship. They're still trying to get a longer term loan or go interest only. So again, I have a feeling that this distorts a lot of the story when you actually look at it from a distributional perspective.
Oh, certainly. Absolutely. I think what is useful in in this to me is just it illustrates that there has been that, as you say, that psychological change for people, because this is, Gen Y, Gen Z, sorry, Gen Y, it's part of Gen Z, but and Gen X's. This is their 1990 moment. This was our 17.5% interest rates. This is the thing that people are going to talk about, 30 years from now to their kids.
Mm.
Where we shifted from a rates only go down with with a few, upticks here and there to, oh my word, rates can go up, and they can go up by a lot. This is by what we've seen since 2022 is the largest and fastest relative rise in mortgage rates in Australian history by a huge margin. And that is going to have very, very significant psychological consequences for people, because going forward, they're going to know and to believe that it's possible that rates can rise, even when all the RBA and the government and all the pundits have said, no, 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 it won't happen, because it did happen. And that, I think, could have some very, very significant impacts on the economy going forward. Because if you look back, say, the 1990s, that cohort had a very mechanical, very real reduction in the cost of their mortgage, to the tune of almost half of the payment burden just evaporating over the period of a couple of years. And that, boosted their fortunes. But by the same token, the fact that the mortgages just weren't that big to begin with, plus decent wage growth, etc., meant that they managed to pay down that burden, and it didn't become a drag on the economy. But in today's world, where wages growth is much weaker, where the mortgages are much larger, and where the mortgages keep getting larger, I think we could see that psychology become a significant drag on spending and just on the appetite for debt, because that is such a key driver of the Aussie economy.
Yep, well, that's true. And if you look at personal credit, of course, the story is quite interesting. There's been a little bit of movement up and down, but there's not been the same exponential growth for personal credit than there has been for the mortgage. And when you sort of stand back and think about it, and again, I see that in my surveys, there are more people now more skeptical about this idea of perpetual debt and want to get shot of it. And I think the shock of high rates are part of it. I think also the unfairness. They feel, well, hang on a moment, I seem to be paying more and more and more of what I earn to the banks. And, is that what I want to go on doing for, a long, long time? Whereas the banks saying, oh, sure, have a 40-year loan or have a 50 loan. We don't mind. No, they don't mind, because they're only interested in perpetual cash flow. Going back to this subscription housing idea again. The truth is that debt can be useful and in some case necessary to be able to do specific things. But as a long-term way of life, I think people are beginning to wake up to the question of whether that makes sense or not.
I think that's true, and I think that there is going to be something of a mindset shift as people see their parents retire with debt, or as more people see their parents retire with debt, I should say. And that's something that you covered recently with the data that you provided to the ABC. Because you're seeing more and more people retiring with debt even after using their super to pay it down. And I think that's going to be a major, major problem, because there's this idea that, that super is going to help, lift all these people out of reliance on the pension. And to a degree, that will be true. But because you had all these people taking on these bigger and bigger and bigger loans, and the simple truth of the matter being that life doesn't always go the way that we plan it will, and you put those factors together, it means more people retiring with larger debts, consuming a larger pool of their super, and those people ending up potentially reliant on the age pension. So I think it's very much going to be an interesting one, because on one hand, you've got these people who've got these huge super balances. They're people who blow the previous cohort of retirees out the water for cash flow and spending. But then you're going to have these other people who, okay, maybe they don't have they don't have the same level of security as previous generations, but they're just going to be retiring with all this debt. And that's not really something that we've confronted, I think, on this scale to that degree before.
No, and I underscore there. And of course, the idea of equity mate, which is still big, but was even bigger previously, where people saw their value of their property rise and thought, oh, we'll grab some of that and we'll go and take a holiday or do this or, extend the property, etc. So that whole equity mate story exacerbated the rise in debt. But I'm seeing in my surveys more and more households now are confronting retirement where incomes tend to sort of go down a little relative to previous, and yet they've still got mortgages. And when you actually look at the assumptions that are made by the modelers thinking about how much do you need when you're in retirement, they've assumed no mortgage.
I think that's a really key point. Like you look at all of those various projections of, oh, you're going to need, $500,000 or $700,000 in addition to a pension and stuff to survive, to achieve the lifestyle that you want. Like you said, retirement in Australia is built on outright home ownership. Now, that's a very, very uncomfortable truth, because the simple reality is that paying a mortgage or paying rent in your retirement can be very, very, very difficult, particularly renting. So I think that's something that really gets overlooked in the whole housing affordability conversation, because people say, well, who cares if people can't afford a house? Who cares if they have to rent? Well, when they arrive at retirement, you're going to care. And I think part of the problem as well is that as we see more and more cohorts retire with mortgage debt and potentially be forced to sell their homes if they can't pay that debt, and if they've already, especially if they've already got an apartment and there's no possibility of downsizing to something smaller, it's even worse. But as you see more and more of these cohorts retire, it's going to put even more and more pressure on public housing. And then what does the government do? You've got people who are aged, who are retired, demanding public housing. So what happens? You can't magic up public housing out of nowhere. Even buying it would cost an absolute arm and a leg. So you're confronted with a very, very challenging social and political situation of what do you do with all these people who don't have homes? Because, it used to be, 20, 25, 30 years ago that you'd have enough kids that at least one of them would be able to help you out. But with more and more people not having children or having smaller families who perhaps don't have the same level of means to help, it's a lot harder. It's a much greater challenge to confront. So I think it's going to get really, really quite challenging. And the simple reality is that we aren't even maintaining the level of public housing as a percentage of housing stock that we had previously, let alone building more.
Yeah, and just building on that, this idea of subscription housing, when you think of that in the context of older age, without the income to come in, how do you continue to pay is the question. And then you think about the move into retirement home settings and those sorts of things, which again is going to be a subscription service of some sort. People need to think through some of these implications, because there is a real question in my mind about whether we've set ourselves up to be able to deal with this alternative model of how finances work. And I don't think we're close. And I think people are going to have a nasty shock.
No, I thoroughly agree with you. I mean, I think the problem is that we've essentially taken on this model of bigger debts, bigger housing prices, and just taken it for granted, collectively at the aggregate. Obviously, I realize, probably the overwhelming majority of the viewers disagree with that particular path being taken, but the reality is that's the path that has been taken by our policymakers.
Yep.
And I think the truth is that we are so incredibly vulnerable to those issues in retirement, to those, I mean, even back to what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago. I mean, if you see these people reaching that age, and then, AI, because obviously a lot of people who, there's studies, for example, from the US Federal Reserve indicating that people who are over the age of 50 and 55 in particular, when they lose their job, the chance of them regaining gainful employment again is significantly lower than it is for younger demographics. And if you're talking about employment being impacted by a technological shift, the impact may be even greater, which further adds to the issue of how are these people going to be able to afford these mortgages? How are they going to be able to afford to house themselves? And there's all of these issues that are potentially on the horizon that just aren't being talked about.
No, and that means that potentially people can't get work when they need work, which is the first point. Or if they can get work, are they capable of continuing to work from a health perspective and from a lifestyle perspective? Or indeed, will people just have to find a way of working for longer and perhaps doing more lowly tasks to try and find a few dollars to be able to actually continue to subscribe to housing? I mean, that's a scary future.
It is, and I think that the truth is that not to get too overly political here, but we never should have removed the safety net in the first place.
Mm.
Like, that was just idiotic. I mean, the idea that, oh well, we're going to give people rent assistance instead of public housing. It's like, so congratulations, you've upped the cost of rent. Well done. And you've, instead of spending billions a year on building new public housing, which appreciates in value, you did that instead. Congratulations, idiots.
Yeah, spot on.
Well, I just find it funny, right, that we've got essentially what many people believe is a government-backed wealth creation scheme using property, and the only people aren't in on it are the government. I mean, they literally could have just created a perpetual motion machine to fund the government just through property if they really wanted to. Just, release a bit, build some public housing, hold on to it for 30 years, sell it, rinse, repeat. All of a sudden you don't have a debt or deficit anymore.
Well done, government.
Okay, this is from the Melbourne University Law School, and it shows, well, basically worker exploitation for workers aged 18 to 30. Now, this isn't just a bunch of random people. This is a survey that is of enough people that it is statistically significant, and a third of workers aged 18 to 30 are paid 40% less than minimum wage. Now, to me, that is an astounding figure. And it also raises some interesting questions regarding who are these people? Who are the people who are comfortable working a job for $15 an hour? Considering the fact that, $15 an hour doesn't even cover, even if you're working a 40-hour week, that doesn't cover the median house rent at a national level. So the question then becomes, is this migrant workers who are being exploited and underpaid? Is it Australians who just need work that badly that they're willing to be underpaid? These are all very important questions that I don't think are being answered. And I also think that it's worth noting that given the level of exploitation on offer here, this is going to be a significant place significant downward pressure on wages growth for these impacted demographics.
Yeah, and I wonder whether there are people there who are in education settings as well and doing, work as part of the education. Then you think, well, hang on a minute, how many international students are coming? Oh, large numbers, eh? Okay, so that another part of the story. But it is really important to understand, and I see this again in my surveys, a lot of younger people, the income levels that they're getting at the moment are just insufficient to be able to even start thinking about forming a family and buying a house, all of those sorts of things. This is part of the problem.
No, 100%. Absolutely. Now, I'm just going to quick fire off through these next three slides because they're all related to each other and somewhat similar. Now, this slide is of average annual productivity growth on a rolling 3-year basis. Now, the reason why I chose 3 years is because productivity can be a little bit noisy in the short term, just shifts that are relatively volatile. Now, what I've done is I've chosen 2 time periods. This is productivity growth on a rolling annual 3-year basis up to the end of 2019. So as you can see, even prior to the pandemic, under the coalition, it was already flatlining. The economy was not in a good place. Now, if we move forward to the next slide, this shows it up until the latest data in the present. And as you can see, it's dived off a cliff. But it is worth noting that there has been that uptick during the pandemic, which was driven by the exodus of temporary visa holders who generally worked lower wage jobs, and also the cutting of hours during the pandemic. So it was generally speaking more productive workers per hour worked in terms of the way it's financially quantified by the ABS working. But I think this slide really sums it up perfectly. As you can see, from basically the middle of the 2010s, productivity more or less flatlined. You then see the big surge during the pandemic, driven by the stimulus, driven by the exodus of temporary visa holders, etc. Before, as the stimulus begins to fade, and as you see migration reopen and temporary visa hold numbers normalize and even rise above where they were previously, you see productivity fall back to earth. So it's not entirely fair to say that the Albanese government has been the driver of productivity decline, but it is fair to say that they haven't done anything positive about it, because we're stuck basically where we were a decade ago.
Yeah, and if you overlay two other thoughts, one is the growth in government debt. There was a huge spike, of course, around the COVID period, and of course, government debt continues to rise. And the other is the share of non-market jobs. When you put those over this same chart too, you can begin to see some of the reasons why we've got where we've got to.
No, absolutely. I mean, if you go through the productivity numbers by industry, by non-market jobs, there is that factor. Although there is something interesting that I found looking through the numbers the other day. Public administration and safety, aka government, actually has a higher level of gross value add than most industries. It's got a higher value add than agriculture, construction, professional and technical services, and all, accommodation, retail, wholesale, you name it. Pretty much most sectors, government is considered more productive than that on a gross value add basis. So in some ways, if you really want to look at it from an extremely mechanical, very basic perspective, what we need is just for everyone to become a directly employed government worker, because then we would improve productivity.
Damn lie statistics. Oh, sorry.
Well, I mean, that's what the data says. So, I mean, it's funny in a way, because we've grown the size of government, but in that particular way, we have actually expanded the level of productivity in the economy. Although on the other hand, the biggest growth that we've seen in employment has been in healthcare and social assistance. And as you say, one of the biggest problems with productivity is that healthcare and social assistance isn't a terribly high value add industry, so it's not considered as productive as a lot of others. So as you see more and more people gravitate towards that, through schemes like the NDIS and other things like that, which, have quite attractive pay packets, that is placing downward pressure on productivity more broadly. So that's one of the problems with pursuing the current strategy. And in that particular vein, it is the Albanese government's responsibility that productivity is suffering.
Yeah, I'll just make the point that the value added concept, which is what's underpinning this, of course, is a particularly economic way of thinking about the value of jobs. Now, I personally think that the value metric that they use is probably a bit flawed, in fact, very flawed. And I'm not saying that people who help people to get, through the day, those in the caring sector are not worth, they are very valuable and absolutely critical. But if you actually are thinking about how to actually generate momentum in the economy, and of course, everybody keeps arguing we need more growth, it's very hard to get growth out of a bigger caring sector simply because of the nature of it. But we're not really getting the investment in other sectors, and going back to the capital shallowing and going back to the narrowness of the economy, that's really the problem that we've got. But it is fascinating that when you stop and think about it, the way the economists measure the value of things, everybody should be employed by the government. Simple.
Well, I got to say, I did think that was pretty funny. You're better off. That it's not the doctors, it's not the nurses, it's not the construction workers or the farmers or even the white collar professional workers. It's the government. I got to say that I found that quite amusing, but it is what it is.
Hello, I'm from the government. I'm here to help you. There you go, proved.
And that's worked out so well. All right. Last slide of the day. Now, before anybody asks, yes, this is from a legitimate source. I actually looked up the market research company that did it, and believe it or not, they've done previous market research and polling work for the European Union government. So that kind of makes this all the more amusing. But what it shows is that across the European Union, the majority of people believe that their country has taken too many migrants. And it's every single one, this is the majority view. And in some cases, in places like Greece, it's the view of 90% of people. Even in Germany, it's the view of 77% of people. So I think that this is just really quite notable that so much of Europe, so much of these electorates are saying no, that they've had enough of migration at that level. Yet, despite these numbers being fairly overwhelming, their governments continue to pursue those strategies.
Yeah, this is very, very important to understand. And of course, we still have significant issues with migration coming from very many parts of the world where there are wars and famines and all those things. And then people are being trafficked across Europe in many areas and end up, for example, in France and then trying to cross the boats into the UK. And the UK are being ineffective in terms of trying to deal with that situation. So I've always believed you need to understand the pull factors and also the push factors why people want to migrate. But I have to say that the policy settings that have been in existence now for quite some period of time, and I'd include Australia and the UK here in this as well, is to grow big and to grow bigger because it comes right back to the GDP number and the fact that, bigger is better. Well, no, it's not. And actually around the world, more and more people are now questioning whether bigger is better. And that really just then cast a whole new set of questions about migration, why migration is where it is, what can be done about it, can we field some of the issues from original sort of formation of the problem. The problem, of course, is that if you sort of block migration into one country, it just gets diverted into another at the moment. So unless there's some coordination and some joined up thinking about tackling this global international crisis, which I think it is, we're going to see it continue.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem as well is that you're just going to see the rise of more and more anti-high migration parties. I mean, you look at, say, for example, like the latest polling modelling done today in the UK, and it shows that basically Labour and the Conservatives would be all but wiped out, reduced, to 50, 60, 70 seats. And, Nigel Farage's Reform Party would basically be in the absolute ascendancy, and that's a wild figure, and then, you've got similar polling data in places like Germany, where the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, is, they're looking at, becoming, by far the largest party in German parliament. So there's all of these various issues coming up, all of these political responses coming up, but they're just being ignored. And in some cases they're being censored, and it's just completely the wrong approach to dealing with this sort of stuff. But ironically, if you pick up a history book and you look at the 1930s and you just go, we've done all this before.
Yes. And that is actually the point, isn't it? We are actually seeing some horrible rhymes from the 1930s, and we all know where that led to. And we also are seeing the rise of dictatorship type behaviors from various politicians around the place, where they're turning down free speech. They're wanting to define what truth is. They're wanting to control what people believe, and of course, control the statistics. which underpins how decisions are made and how information is communicated, which comes right back to where we started this conversation, Tarric, which is why having good, robust, objective, independent information is absolutely critical to democracy and to freedom for the future. And the more that information is diluted, destroyed, repurposed, alternative truths, all of that stuff, it means that there is a greater and greater risk of the 1930s playing out again.
Yeah, or one particular year, 1984.
Well, funny that. And I keep coming to that book quite often these days. And I just remind people the whole preface of the book, the whole idea of the book is that the truth is determined and controlled by the people who are in charge, and everybody else is cannon fodder.
Well, what did Orwell say about the future? A boot stomping on a human face for eternity?
Yeah, exactly. And unfortunately, politicians seem to be quite willing to play along at the moment, and that's a big problem. Tarric, this has been a very important conversation, as always. Thank you very much for all the work on the slides there. And I think we've touched some really important issues today.
Well, thanks for having me, Martin. It's always a pleasure.
Look forward to the next time.
Me too, mate. See you then.
See ya. Bye-bye.